Hi guys, welcome to Whispered History. American history told slowly and quietly, one story at a time.
Whispered History.
Half the people who signed the paper that created your country were already dying men. Not from war. From the water they drank, the food they ate, and the simple act of living in a world that had no idea what a germ was. Think about that for a moment. The men we carved into marble, the ones we named cities and highways after, spent most of their days quietly afraid of a toothache. A cut on the hand could kill you by the end of the week. A fever that we'd shrug off today with a pill from the drugstore could empty an entire household before the next full moon. This is the year we all think we know. 1776. Fireworks, flags, a bold signature on a bold document. But the America of that summer wasn't a painting. It was loud and dirty, and it smelled like wood smoke and horse and human sweat baked into wool that hadn't been washed in weeks. So here's the question I want you to sit with tonight slowly before we go any further. If you woke up tomorrow in the America of 1776, would you survive the year? Before we step back into that world together, let me tell you where you are. This is Whispered History, a quiet corner of the internet where we tell the true, human stories behind the dates you memorized in school and forgot by summer. If you like your history soft-spoken, honest, and told the way one person tells another late at night, stay with me. Subscribe gently whenever it feels right, and I'll keep these stories coming, one calm evening at a time. Now, let's leave the fireworks behind and walk into the year as it actually was. Start with the morning. There's no alarm clock because the clock as you know it barely exists in most homes. You wake because the light is coming through a window that has no glass, or thick warped glass that turns the sunrise into a smear of gold. The air in the room is cold, genuinely cold, the kind that bites at your nose because the fire went out hours ago, and someone, probably a child, has to coax it back to life before anyone eats. In a New England winter, water left in a bowl overnight would freeze solid, indoors, a few feet from where your family slept. You didn't sleep alone. You almost certainly shared a bed, and often shared a room, with parents, siblings, sometimes strangers passing through. Privacy, the thing we now treat as a birthright, was a luxury almost nobody owned. And the smell. We have to talk about the smell, because it's the first thing that would hit a modern person and never let go. People bathed a few times a year, if that. A full body wash was considered slightly dangerous, something that could let sickness into the body through open pores. So the human scent of the era was constant, layered, and completely normal to everyone breathing it. Add to that the animals, chickens underfoot, pigs in the street of nearly every town, acting as the original garbage disposal, eating whatever rotted in the gutters, horses everywhere, and everything horses leave behind steaming in the summer heat. A city like Philadelphia, the largest in the colonies, held around 40,000 people. That made it a giant by American standards, and a small crowded town by the standards of London or Paris. And in that crowded town, human waste, animal waste, and kitchen scraps all shared the same narrow streets. What's remarkable is that the men arguing about liberty in that summer heat were doing it in a building surrounded by all of this. The famous room where they debated independence had its windows shut against the flies and the stench, and the delegates, in heavy formal coats, nearly cooked alive inside. Now, let's talk about the thing that shaped every single life in that year more than any king or army. Death. 1 out of every 4 children born in 1776 did not live to see their 10th birthday. Sit with that number, 1 in 4. A mother in that world could give birth 8, 9, 10 times and expect to bury 2 or 3 of those children before they grew up. Losing a baby wasn't a rare tragedy that broke a family forever. It was an ordinary grief, expected, absorbed, and quietly carried while the rest of the work of survival went on. Childbirth itself was one of the most dangerous things a person could do. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of infection. A doctor might go straight from handling a corpse to delivering a baby with the same unwashed hands, and no one thought a thing of it. Doctors, honestly, were often as likely to hurt you as help you. The finest medical mind of the age still believed that draining your blood could cure a fever. They'd open a vein, catch the blood in a bowl, and watch a sick, weakened patient grow paler, calling it treatment. The man who would soon lead the whole revolution, George Washington, would eventually die, years later, partly because his own doctors drained so much of his blood trying to save him from a throat infection. The most powerful, most respected people in America couldn't buy their way out of this. That's how deep it ran. So this was the strange truth of that celebrated year. The people we imagine as titans were, in their own bodies, incredibly fragile. They wrote soaring words about life and liberty while living inside bodies that could be undone by a splinter, a chill, or a bad oyster. And most of them knew it. They wrote letters, quiet and honest, about the children they'd lost, about aching teeth pulled with a string and a hard yank, or with iron pliers and no numbing at all, about the dread of the fever season coming each summer like a tide no one could stop. There's a reason they valued every single day the way they did. When you can feel death standing that close, freedom starts to mean something sharper. It stops being a slogan and becomes the one thing that might outlive you. But here's where it gets complicated, and where the story we're going to tell over these next hours turns from a simple tale into something far more human. Not everyone in that America was fighting for their own freedom. For roughly 1 in 5 people living in the 13 colonies, 1776 wasn't the birth of liberty at all. It was another year of bondage. The same summer those famous words were written, hundreds of thousands of enslaved men, women and children woke to the same cold mornings, the same danger, the same fragile bodies, and none of the promise. That contradiction sat right at the centre of the new nation from its very first breath. We'll come back to that, gently and honestly, because you can't understand this year without it. So think again about the question I asked you at the start. Could you survive a year here? Not the war, not the battles you read about in school, just the ordinary daily grind of staying alive in a world with no clean water, no real medicine, no refrigeration, and no mercy for the weak. The food that could poison you slowly, the winters that could freeze you in your own home, the infections that turned small wounds into death sentences, the work, endless and brutal, that started before dawn and only ended when your body gave out. We've spent 2.5 centuries turning that year into a symbol, a tidy story of brave men and a bold idea, and that story is true as far as it goes. But underneath it there was another story, quieter, harder, more real, the story of what it actually felt like to be alive and breathing and afraid in the America of 1776. That's the story we're going to live inside together, slowly, over the hours ahead. Not the myth carved in marble, the people, warm and frightened and fully human, who lived and died beneath it. So take a breath. Let the modern world fade for a while, because we're about to step through the door of an ordinary home on an ordinary morning in the most extraordinary year America ever named its own, and see it at last, the way the people who actually there once did. Let the darkness settle in for a second. Real darkness, the kind we almost never feel anymore. When the sun went down in 1776, the world didn't dim, it vanished. There were no streetlights humming to life, no glow from a phone on the nightstand, no amber leak of a porch bulb from 3 houses down. Once that last band of light drained out of the western sky, the night that came was total, thick, and old. The same darkness that had covered this land for 10,000 years. So light was precious. You'd feel that the moment you tried to do anything after dusk, a single candle was worth working for. Most families made their own, dipping wicks again and again into hot tallow, the rendered fat of animals, until each one grew fat enough to burn. Those candles smelled faintly of the meat they came from, and they gave off a small trembling flame that a draught could kill in an instant. The wealthy could afford something better, candles made from spermaceti, a waxy substance harvested from the heads of sperm whales, burned brighter and cleaner and didn't stink, but even in a fine home, you didn't waste them. So picture the light you'd actually live by. One flame, maybe two, a pool of gold no wider than a dinner table, and beyond its edge, a wall of shadow where the rest of the room simply disappeared. Families gathered close inside that little ring of light. That's not a romantic image someone invented later. It's just physics. The warmth and the light and the safety all lived in the same small circle, and so did the people. Now bring the cold back into it. Heat came from one place, the hearth, a wide stone fireplace that was the beating heart of nearly every home. If you stood in front of it, your face burned. If you turned around, your back froze. People spoke of that split feeling. Time roasting on one side, shivering on the other all winter long. The fire had to be tended like a living thing. Letting it go out completely was a small disaster, because matches as we know them didn't exist yet. Relighting a dead fire meant striking flint against steel, coaxing a single spark into a scrap of scorched cloth, and breathing on it, slowly, patiently, until a fragile ember agreed to grow. On a bitter morning, with numb fingers that could take a long, miserable while, so the smarter move was to never let it die, to bank the coals at night under a blanket of ash and pray they'd still be glowing at dawn. Now let's fill the air with sound, because the silence of that world would unsettle you almost as much as the dark. There was no hum, no refrigerator cycling in the next room, no traffic, no planes overhead, no music unless someone in the room was making it with their own hands and voice. What you'd hear instead was smaller and closer and strangely alive. The pop and hiss of the fire, the wind pushing against the walls and finding every crack, a dog somewhere down the lane, the creak of the house settling, the soft, endless breathing of other people sleeping a few feet away, and outside in a town the sounds were entirely human and animal. Cartwheels grinding over dirt and stone, the clop of hooves, church bells marking the hours for people who owned no clock. A night watchman calling out the time and the weather as he walked, letting everyone know that all was well. Voices carried in that quiet. An argument 3 houses down was everyone's business. A baby crying at midnight was heard by the whole street. You were never as alone as we are now, and never as private either. Now let's talk about what filled your stomach, because the food of 1776 would surprise you, in both directions. For most ordinary families, the daily meal was heavy, plain, and endlessly repetitive. Corn, in some form, nearly every day. Cornmeal mush, cornbread, corn boiled and fried and baked until you couldn't taste it anymore. Bread was the centre of life for many, dark and dense and made from whatever grain the region grew. Salted pork was the great preserver of protein, packed in barrels to survive the months when nothing fresh could be had. Vegetables came and went with the seasons and got dried, salted, or buried in cool cellars to last. There was no way to keep anything cold in summer beyond a springhouse or a deep cellar, so people ate with the calendar, and hunger had a rhythm to it. Sugar was a luxury, sold in hard cones you had to chip at with special tools. Coffee and tea were treasured, and tea, of course, had just become a political weapon. The very act of what you drank in the morning could mark you as loyal to the crown or hungry for rebellion. And here's something that would truly stop a modern person cold. Almost everyone, including children, drank alcohol all day long. This wasn't about getting drunk. It was about staying alive. Water from a town well or a slow creek could carry sickness that no one could see or explain. But cider, beer, and rum had been through a process that, though no one understood the science, made them far safer to drink. So a working man might start his day with a mug of hard cider at breakfast, drink more through his labour, and finish with rum at night. Farm workers were often paid partly in liquor. Even the water-shy morning began with something fermented, poured for the whole family, young and old alike. Now step outside and feel the ground under your feet. There are no paved roads in the way you know them. In dry weather, the streets were dust that coated everything, your clothes, your throat, your food. In wet weather, they became rivers of thick mud that could swallow a boot or a wheel or a horse's leg up to the knee. Travel was slow in a way that's almost impossible for us to feel now. A journey from Boston to Philadelphia, a trip you could make today in a couple of hours by plane, took the better part of 2 weeks by carriage over those roads. Most people in 1776 never travelled more than a day's walk from the place they were born. Their entire world, everyone they'd ever love or fear or bury, lived inside a circle a few miles wide. The clothes on your back would feel foreign too. Everything was made by hand, every thread of it. Spinning wool and flax into yarn, weaving that yarn into cloth, sewing that cloth into a shirt, all of it took countless hours of human labour, most of it done by women who never stopped moving. A single shirt represented days of work. So clothes were mended and mended again, and passed down until they fell apart, then torn into rags that were saved and used for something else. The fabric itself was scratchy and heavy against the skin. Wool in winter, linen in summer, rough and warm and rarely, if ever, truly clean. You'd itch, you'd sweat, you'd get used to it, because there was no other choice. And through all of this, quietly, constantly ran the labour, the endless, physical, dawn-to-dark labour that we've almost entirely forgotten. Water didn't come from a tap. Someone hauled it, bucket by heavy bucket, from a well or a stream, sometimes many times a day. Wood didn't heat itself. It had to be chopped, split, stacked and carried in quantities that would exhaust a modern gym regular within a week. Food wasn't bought. It was grown, raised, slaughtered, ground, churned, salted, and cooked, every single step done by hand, over fire, in the same few rooms where people slept. A woman's work in that world genuinely never ended, and the phrase they used for it wasn't an exaggeration. So here you are now, standing inside it. The cold house, the one flickering candle, the smell of tallow and wood smoke and unwashed wool, the heavy food and the fermented drink, the mud outside and the total darkness beyond the door, the quiet that hums with human closeness, and the work that never, ever stops. This was the ordinary world, not the battlefield, not the meeting hall, not the grand words on parchment, just the daily physical fact of being alive in America in that year, before we sanded it smooth and framed it on a wall. And it's into this world, warm and hard and utterly real, that an idea was about to drop like a stone into still water, because the people living these small, difficult lives were about to be told that they weren't subjects anymore, that they were something the world had barely dared to name. And to understand what that idea truly cost them, we first have to clear away the biggest myth of all, the one almost every one of us was taught, and almost none of us ever questioned. Most people believed the American Revolution was something almost everyone wanted. A whole people, united, rising up as one against a distant king. It's a beautiful picture. It's also quietly mostly wrong. The truth is stranger, and far more human. In 1776, the colonies were not one people with one dream. They were a divided, uncertain, deeply anxious collection of neighbours who often couldn't agree on the weather, let alone a war. Historians have spent a long time trying to sort out how the colonists actually felt. The rough shape that emerged is often described three ways. Roughly a third leaned toward independence. Roughly a third stayed loyal to the crown, or wanted to. And a large group in the middle just wanted to be left alone, to keep their heads down and to survive whatever was coming. Even that split is generous to the rebels, because wanting change and being willing to die for it are two very different things. Many who grumbled about British taxes still went pale at the word treason, and treason is exactly what this was. Every man who signed that famous document was, in the eyes of the law, committing a crime punishable by death. That's the part we sand away. We remember the signing as a triumphant scene, quills and pride and destiny. But the men in that room knew, with total clarity, that they were writing their own possible death warrants. If the revolution failed, and there was every reason to think it might, they could be hanged, their property seized, their families ruined, their names erased or spat on for generations. One of them reportedly joked, in that heavy summer room, that they must all hang together, or they'd surely hang separately. It's a clever line. It's also the gallows humour of frightened men who understood exactly how thin their odds were. So let's break the biggest myth cleanly. The revolution wasn't a united people casting off a tyrant. It was a bitter, divided, and often vicious civil war. That phrase surprises people, so let me slow down and stay with it. We call it a revolution, which makes it sound like colonists against redcoats, Americans against the British, a clean line drawn across an ocean. But the deepest wounds of that war weren't between strangers separated by a sea. They were between neighbours. Loyalists, the colonists who stayed faithful to the king, weren't a foreign enemy. They were your baker, your cousin, the family in the next farmhouse who'd shared your table for 20 years. And when the fighting came, communities tore themselves apart from the inside. Loyalists were harassed, beaten, and driven from their homes. Some were tarred and feathered, which we now say almost as a cartoon, but which was, in reality, a brutal torture that could strip the skin from a living body. Hot tar poured onto bare flesh, then feathers, then a man paraded through the streets to be mocked and sometimes to die of his burns. That was neighbour doing that to neighbour, over politics, over loyalty, over which side of an impossible question you happened to land on. By the end of the war, tens of thousands of loyalists fled the country entirely. They abandoned homes and land and lives, pouring north into Canada or across the ocean to a Britain many of them had never even seen. They were refugees, in their own way, from a war we usually remember only as a victory. So here's the second myth, quietly folded inside the first. We imagine 1776 as a moment of clarity, a people who suddenly knew who they were and what they believed. The reality was doubt, enormous, paralysing doubt. Even the men leading the charge had sleepless nights. They weren't sure they could win. They weren't sure the other colonies would stand with them. They weren't even sure in those first raw months that ordinary people would follow at all. And there's evidence they were right to worry. When the war came, the Continental Army, the force meant to defend this bold new idea, was chronically, desperately short of men. It struggled constantly to fill its ranks. Soldiers went unpaid for months, sometimes years. They deserted in large numbers, walking home to farms and families that were starving without them. This wasn't a nation marching proudly to war behind its heroes. It was a fragile, underfunded, half-supported rebellion that came within a breath of collapsing more than once. What's remarkable is how close the whole thing came to simply falling apart, not from British strength, but from its own people's exhaustion and division. We remember the outcome, so we assume it was always meant to happen. The people living it had no such comfort. Now let's break one more piece of the myth, because it matters for everything that follows. The idea that these men were fighting for freedom for everyone. The words they wrote were extraordinary. that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with certain unalienable rights, those words would go on to change the world again and again for centuries. But we have to be honest about what they meant in that room, in that year. The man who wrote that soaring line about all men being created equal owned more than 100 human beings. Thomas Jefferson penned those words about equality, while enslaved people worked the fields of his home, cooked his meals, and made his comfortable life possible. This isn't said to tear him down. It's said because the contradiction is the story. The founders wrote a promise so large that they themselves couldn't or wouldn't live up to it. They lit a fire they couldn't fully control, and the smoke of it still hangs over this country today. For enslaved Americans, for women, for men who owned no property, the grand words of that summer didn't apply. Freedom, as declared in 1776, was real, and it was also painfully, deliberately narrow. So the myth we inherited is a kind of comforting shorthand. United people, clear purpose, freedom for all. The truth underneath is messier, darker, and honestly more compelling. A divided people, a terrifying gamble, a promise made by imperfect men that reached far beyond their own courage to keep it. And here's the strange, beautiful part. That messier truth doesn't shrink the founding, it makes it larger. Because a perfect people doing an easy, popular thing isn't a story worth telling. A frightened, divided, contradictory people doing something dangerous and uncertain and only half understanding what they'd unleashed. That's a story that can hold you for hours. But myths are made of ideas, and ideas can feel cold. To really feel that year, to understand what this gamble cost, we can't stay up in the clouds of a third here and a third there. We have to come back down to the ground, back to a single house, a single hearth, a single, real person with a name and a face and a family and everything to lose. Because somewhere in that divided, frightened country, there were ordinary people who had to decide, personally, quietly, and often alone, what all of this was worth to them. And one of them, a real woman, in a real farmhouse, was about to carry the whole weight of a revolution on her own two shoulders, while the man whose name we remember was hundreds of miles away, changing the world on paper. Her name was Abigail Adams. And in the summer of 1776, while her husband sat in a hot room in Philadelphia, helping to invent a country, she was 200 miles away, alone, trying to keep her children alive. We remember John Adams, the second president, the fierce, brilliant, difficult man whose name fills the history books. But John himself would tell you, plainly and often, that he couldn't have done any of it without her. And her story, the ordinary daily weight she carried, tells you more about what 1776 actually cost than any speech ever could. Picture her, though not the way we usually do, not a portrait on a wall. A woman in her early 30s, small, sharp-eyed, with a mind that could cut through nonsense like a blade. She'd had almost no formal schooling. Girls in that world rarely did. But she'd read everything she could reach in her father's house, and she wrote letters so vivid and so honest that historians still read them today to understand what that year truly felt like. She ran a farm in Braintree, Massachusetts. And when I say she ran it, I mean she ran all of it. John was gone for years at a stretch, off doing the work of the revolution. So the planting, the harvest, the animals, the money, the hired help, the endless repairs, all of it fell to Abigail. She managed the whole operation while raising their children largely by herself. She had 4 surviving children in that period to care for. One of them, a serious little boy named John Quincy, would grow up to become a president himself one day. But in 1776 he was just a frightened kid, and she was just his mother, trying to shield him from a world that was coming apart. Now lay her in the fear, because Braintree wasn't safe, tucked far from the fighting. It was close to Boston, close to where the war first caught fire. From a hill near her home, Abigail could hear the cannons. She could actually see the smoke rising over Boston when the fighting came. She once climbed that hill with young John Quincy at her side and watched in the distance the Battle of Bunker Hill, listening to the guns that were killing men she might have known. Think about that for a moment. Standing on a hill with your small son's hand in yours, watching the smoke of a battle, not knowing if the soldiers pouring toward it would win or turn and come for your home next. That was her daily reality, not the glory of revolution, the grinding dread of it. And then came the sickness, because in that world the war wasn't even the deadliest threat. Disease swept through the region in those years, and Abigail faced it mostly alone. At one point she made an agonizing choice that shows exactly the kind of courage she had. There was a disease called smallpox. We've almost forgotten it now, but in her time it was one of the most feared killers on earth. It could scar you, blind you, or kill you, and it tore through communities without mercy. There was a crude, terrifying early form of protection called inoculation. The idea was to deliberately give a person a small, controlled dose of the disease, hoping they'd survive it and be safe forever after. But it was dangerous. People sometimes died from the inoculation itself. Abigail made the decision to have herself and all 4 of her children inoculated. She gathered her kids, travelled to where it could be done, and deliberately exposed them to a disease that could kill them, because she believed the risk of doing nothing was worse. Then she nursed them through it, watched them fall ill, one by one, watched the fever take hold and the sores appear, and prayed over each small body that this gamble wouldn't take them from her. They survived, all of them. But she made that call without her husband there to share the weight, writing to him about it after the danger had already passed, because there was no time to wait for his reply. And here's the part that lifts her story out of the ordinary and into something extraordinary. She didn't just endure her world, she tried to change it. In the spring of 1776, as the men debated independence, Abigail sat down and wrote her husband a letter that still stuns people today. She told him that if the men were building a new set of laws, a new country, they should, in her words, remember the ladies. She warned him, half joking and half deadly serious, that women wouldn't hold themselves bound by laws they had no voice in making. She saw clearly in that very moment of creation that the grand words about liberty were leaving half the population behind. John's reply was affectionate and dismissive. He laughed it off. He told her, essentially, that he couldn't help but smile at her boldness, and the matter went no further. But she'd said it. In 1776, in the middle of everything, a farm wife with cannons echoing in her ears looked at the birth of a nation and quietly pointed at the crack running through its foundation. Most people don't realize that the first argument for women's equality in America was made not in a hall or a courtroom, but in a private letter by a woman who'd just risked her children's lives to smallpox and was about to bring in the harvest alone. That was Abigail Adams, not a symbol, a person, a woman who was cold in the winter and exhausted year-round, who buried her fears in letters because there was no one else to tell, who lost a baby of her own in those years, a little girl stillborn, a grief she carried quietly while the world called her husband a hero. She wasn't fighting on a battlefield, but make no mistake, she was fighting to keep a farm from failing children, dying, a household from collapsing, and a marriage alive across 200 miles of terrible roads and months of silence. Her letters to John are full of longing. She missed him with an ache that comes right off the page even now. She'd end her days of impossible labour and sit by a single candle, writing to a man she wasn't sure she'd ever see again, pouring out the news of the farm, the children, the war, and her own tired heart. And through all of it, she kept the home standing, which meant she kept him standing, which meant in a very real way she helped keep the whole fragile revolution standing, one harvest and one nursed child at a time. This is the part of 1776 we almost never tell. For every famous man in that Philadelphia room, there was someone like Abigail, someone holding the actual world together while history got written somewhere else. The wives, the mothers, the daughters, the enslaved people whose labour never stopped, the ordinary families who paid for the grand idea with their sweat, their fear, and sometimes their lives, and whose names we've simply lost. Abigail's name survived only because she wrote it down, in ink, in letters she couldn't have known we'd ever read. How many thousands of others did exactly what she did, and vanished, unrecorded into the quiet, so hold on to her. The small, fierce woman on the hill, watching the smoke, her son's hand in hers. We'll come back to her, because her thread runs all the way through this story. Her fear, her strength, and that quiet warning about the ladies that America wouldn't truly answer for nearly 150 more years. But right now, in 1776, Abigail believed in it, believed enough to risk everything and hold everything together, for a promise she herself wasn't even fully included in. And that raises a question that changes how you see this entire year. Why? Why would ordinary people, who stood to gain so little and lose so much, pour their lives into this dangerous gamble? The answer isn't the one we're usually given, and when you finally see it clearly, the whole story of 1776 turns, quietly, on its head. Here's what we're taught: that the revolution was about freedom, big, shining, abstract freedom. And that's true, but it's the kind of truth that hides a deeper one underneath. Because if you'd walked up to an ordinary farmer in 1776 and asked him why he might risk his life, he probably wouldn't have given you a speech about liberty and the rights of man. He'd have talked about something much closer to the ground: money, land, debt, the very concrete, very personal fear of losing everything he'd worked for. Let me show you the world the way he actually saw it. Because the revolution didn't start with a grand idea. It started with a bill. For most of colonial history, the colonists had lived under British rule fairly comfortably. They largely governed their own daily lives. London was far away, an ocean and 2 months of sailing distant, and mostly it left them alone. But then Britain fought an enormous, expensive war. We call it the French and Indian War, part of a larger global conflict, and Britain won it, pushing France out of much of North America. That victory made the colonies safer than they'd ever been. But wars cost money, staggering amounts of money. And when it was over, Britain looked at its massive war debt, looked across the ocean at the colonies it had just spent a fortune protecting, and made a decision that would change everything. The colonists, London decided, should help pay the bill. It seemed reasonable enough in London. We defended you. You should share the cost. So a series of taxes began to roll across the Atlantic. Taxes on sugar, taxes on official documents and paper, taxes on paint, on glass, on tea. Small things in a way. But it wasn't really the amount that lit the fire. It was the principle. For generations, these colonists had taxed themselves through their own local assemblies, their own elected representatives. Now a parliament 3,000 miles away, a parliament they had no vote in, no voice in, no seat in, was reaching into their pockets. That's where the famous phrase was born. No taxation without representation. It sounds like a slogan now, worn smooth by repetition. But feel what's underneath it. It's the fury of a people being told they'll pay and pay and pay, with no say in how much or why. It's the specific burning insult of powerlessness. And here's the layer we almost always miss. This wasn't only about principle for a lot of these men, it was about survival and cold hard cash. Take the wealthy planters of Virginia, men like Jefferson and Washington. We picture them as rich, powerful, comfortable, and they were, in land and in enslaved labour. But many of them were also drowning in debt, deeply, dangerously in debt to British merchants and banks across the ocean. The whole system was rigged in Britain's favour. Colonial planters grew tobacco, shipped it to England, and were forced to buy their manufactured goods, their furniture, their cloth, their luxuries, back from England at prices Britain set. Many great Virginia estates looked magnificent on the outside and were quietly rotting with debt on the inside. So when these men spoke of throwing off British chains, it wasn't purely poetry. Some of them, quite literally, owed British creditors more than they could ever repay. Independence wouldn't just free their country, it might free them personally from debts that were strangling their entire way of life. This is the uncomfortable complexity we usually skip. The men who gave us those soaring words about liberty had reasons that were also deeply practical, deeply financial, and deeply self-interested. Now, does that make the revolution a lie? No. And this is the part that matters. History isn't a story of pure heroes or pure villains. It's a story of real people with mixed motives, doing enormous things for a tangle of reasons all at once. A man can want liberty for his soul and relief for his wallet in the very same breath. He can believe sincerely in the rights of man and also want the British creditor off his back. Both things can be true. They usually are. And there's another angle that flips the picture again. Because from London's side, the colonists looked wildly unreasonable. The British had just spent enormous sums defending these people. British soldiers had bled and died in American forests fighting the French. Taxes in Britain itself were far higher than anything the colonists were being asked to pay. From a Londoner's chair, the colonists were spoiled children, protected at great cost, asked to chip in a modest, fair amount, and throwing a violent tantrum in response. There were people in Britain who genuinely could not understand what all the fury was about, and they weren't entirely wrong either. That's the thing about this story. Stand in London, and the colonists look ungrateful and reckless. Stand in Boston, and the British look like tyrants squeezing a people who only want a voice. Both views have real truth in them. The revolution wasn't good against evil. It was one set of legitimate grievances crashing into another until compromise became impossible and blood became inevitable. Now let's add the piece that reframes everything. There was a huge, silent factor in all of this that we rarely connect to the story. Land. To the west of the colonies lay a vast, tempting expanse of territory. Colonists dreamed of pushing into it, claiming it, farming it, getting rich on it. But after that expensive war, Britain drew a line on the map, a proclamation that told the colonists they couldn't settle past a certain boundary in the west. Britain wanted to avoid costly new conflicts with the native nations who already lived on that land. To land-hungry colonists, that line was an outrage. They'd fought in that war partly to open the west, and now the Crown was slamming the door. For men like Washington, who'd invested heavily in Western land, that boundary threatened real fortunes. So underneath the noble language, there was hunger. Hunger for land that wasn't theirs, land already lived on by people who'd been there for thousands of years. The freedom some colonists wanted was, in part, the freedom to expand onto someone else's ground. What strikes me most is how the same year could hold so many opposite truths at once. A genuine cry for representation and a grab for Western land. A soaring belief in liberty and a ledger full of debt. A fight for the rights of man, waged by men who denied those rights to others. This is the perspective shift. 1776 wasn't a single clean story. It was a dozen stories tangled together, pulling in every direction at once. Principle and profit, idealism and self-interest, courage and contradiction, all braided into the same rope that pulled a new nation into being. And ordinary people, people like Abigail on her farm, people whose names we'll never know, were caught in the middle of it, feeling all of it at once, the fear, the hope, the anger, the hunger, and the dawning, terrifying sense that the world they knew was ending. Because it was ending. The taxes, the debts, the land, the insult, the fear, all of it had been building for years like pressure behind a dam, and now in this one hot summer, the dam was about to break. Not slowly, not gently, all at once, in a way no one, on either side of the ocean, was truly prepared for. And the people living those small, hard, ordinary lives were about to be swept up into something far larger and far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. It happened faster than anyone expected. That's the part we forget. We look back and see it as inevitable, a straight line from tax to war to independence. But the people living it felt no such thing. They felt the ground shifting under their feet, faster and faster, until there was nothing solid left to stand on. Blood had already been spilled, more than a year before that famous summer it began. In a small town called Lexington, on a cold April morning, colonial militia faced British soldiers on a village green. No one knows who fired first, but someone did. And when the smoke cleared, men lay dead on the grass. Ordinary men, farmers, neighbours, killed in the grey light of dawn over a quarrel with a king. The fighting spread that same day to a place called Concord. British troops marching back toward Boston were ambushed the whole way. Colonists fired from behind stone walls, from trees, from farmhouse windows, cutting the redcoat column to pieces mile after bloody mile. By nightfall, hundreds were dead or wounded, and the thing everyone had feared and half hoped would never truly come had arrived. This was war. Now feel how the pace changes, because after Lexington everything sped up. Cannons at Bunker Hill, the one Abigail watched from her hill, her son beside her. The British won that fight, but they paid a horrifying price, losing men in numbers that stunned their own commanders. A hard lesson landed that day. These colonists, these amateurs, these farmers with muskets could bleed the finest army in the world. It wouldn't be quick, it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be bloodless. In town after town, the machinery of daily life began to break down. Royal governors fled, courts stopped working, old authority simply evaporated, and into that vacuum stepped ordinary people, forming committees, raising militias, choosing sides. You couldn't stay neutral for long. The war reached into every home and demanded an answer. Which side are you on? Now add the fear that spread through the towns. Rumours moved faster than facts. Word came that the British were hiring foreign soldiers, Hessians they were called, professional troops from the German states, sold into service far from home. To colonists the news landed like a threat and an insult at once. Their own king was sending foreign mercenaries to force them back into line. The stories grew in the telling. Tales of towns burned, of homes looted, of women and children turned out into the cold. Some of it was true, some of it was fear doing what fear does. But the effect was the same. People began to understand that this wouldn't be a gentleman's disagreement. it would be brutal. Then came the words that made it real. In the winter before that famous summer, a pamphlet appeared. It was called Common Sense, written by a recent immigrant named Thomas Paine, a man who'd failed at nearly everything he'd tried before picking up a pen. But that pen changed history. Paine did something no one had quite dared to do. He didn't just complain about taxes or bad laws. He attacked the whole idea of a king. He called monarchy itself absurd, a con, a fraud dressed up in gold and ceremony. He wrote in plain language for plain people, not in the dense legal talk of lawyers, but in words a farmer could read by candlelight and feel in his gut. And read it they did. The pamphlet spread like wildfire through the colonies. Hundreds of thousands of copies in a land of only a few million people. It was passed hand to hand, read aloud in taverns, argued over at every hearth. Paine took the idea of independence, which had been whispered and feared, and made it speakable. He made it feel not just possible, but obvious, righteous, overdue, and the mood shifted. You could almost feel it turn. The middle ground, the third who just wanted to be left alone, began to shrink. Every act of British force, every rumour of mercenaries, every column of smoke pushed more of them off the fence. Now the pressure reached the men in Philadelphia, because all of this, the blood, the fear, the pamphlet, the shifting mood, landed on the shoulders of the delegates gathered there. They'd come, many of them, hoping to patch things up, to find some compromise, some way back to peace with Britain. Independence had been a step too far for most of them, even now, but events were dragging them forward faster than their own courage could keep pace. Every week brought worse news. Every week made reconciliation look more like a fantasy. They argued through that spring, bitterly, late into the nights. Some pushed hard for independence, others begged for caution, terrified of what a full break would unleash. They knew what was at stake. If they declared independence and lost, they'd hang. If they didn't declare it, they might lose the fragile momentum keeping the whole rebellion alive. And behind them, across all 13 colonies, ordinary people waited. Farmers who'd left their fields, wives like Abigail holding homes together, young men already dying in skirmishes and sieges, wondering what, exactly, they were dying for. They needed an answer, a reason, a cause with a name. The war was already here. The blood was already spilled. But there was still no country, no declaration, no line drawn that said, clearly, this is who we are and what we're fighting to become. The men in Philadelphia understood at last that half measures were finished. The time for careful complaints and polite petitions had died on the green at Lexington. They could feel it closing in. The point of no return. A moment when they'd either commit fully, treason and all, or watch the whole thing collapse into chaos and defeat. And that moment was coming, fast, in the heat of a Philadelphia summer. But to understand what they were about to do, and why it terrified them so deeply, you have to understand what was really happening behind those closed doors, because the decision to break from Britain wasn't made by a united, confident Congress marching toward destiny. It was made by frightened, divided men, manoeuvring, pressuring, and quietly forcing one another toward a cliff none of them could see the bottom of. And the machinery behind that decision, the deals, the fears, the hidden hands pushing events forward, is a story far stranger than the tidy version we are handed in school. The Declaration of Independence wasn't born in a moment of unity. It was born in a pressure cooker of fear, strategy, and quiet manipulation. We picture a room full of confident patriots, ready to sign. The reality was a room full of nervous men, many of whom were being pushed, cornered, and outmaneuvered into a decision they weren't sure they wanted to make. Let me pull back the curtain on how it actually worked, because the machinery behind that summer is stranger and more human than the painting suggests. Start with the Congress itself. It had no real power. Think about that. The Continental Congress wasn't a government. It had no authority to tax, no army it truly controlled, no legal right to exist at all in the eyes of the Crown. It was technically an illegal gathering of representatives from colonies that were supposed to answer to the king. These men had no official standing. They were improvising a nation out of thin air, with no rule book, no precedent, and no guarantee anyone would follow them. And they didn't all answer to the same masters. Each delegate came with instructions from his own colony. Some colonies had explicitly forbidden their delegates from voting for independence. Others were wildly in favour. Others hadn't made up their minds and swung back and forth with every piece of news. So the men in that room weren't free agents. They were tangled in a web of local politics, sending frantic letters home, waiting on new instructions, trying to hold 13 very different agendas together long enough to act. Now here's the first hidden gear. For independence to mean anything, the vote had to be unanimous, not majority. Unanimous. All 13 colonies had to agree, or the whole thing would look weak, divided, and doomed from the start. A declaration backed by only 9 or 10 colonies would be a gift to the British. It would prove the colonists were split. It would invite them to be conquered one by one. So the pressure wasn't just to win a vote, it was to force a total, unbroken agreement out of a deeply divided assembly, and that meant manoeuvring. Quiet, relentless, behind-the-scenes manoeuvring. The men pushing hardest for independence, John Adams chief among them, worked the room like the shrewdest of operators. They lobbied, they persuaded, they cornered the hesitant in hallways and taverns and private lodgings. They knew that public speeches only went so far. The real work happened in whispers. Now here's a detail that changes how you see the whole thing. The vote for independence was very nearly not unanimous at all. When the moment came, some colonies weren't ready. Pennsylvania was deeply divided. New York's delegates had no authority to vote yes and had to abstain entirely. Delaware was split down the middle between its 2 delegates present. The whole Grand Declaration teetered on the edge of a messy, humiliating split, and the way it was saved reads more like a thriller than a history lesson. In Delaware, the tie between 2 delegates had to be broken. There was a 3rd delegate, a man named Caesar Rodney, who was miles away at home and gravely ill. He suffered from a painful disease, likely a cancer that disfigured his face, which he hid behind a green silk scarf. He was exactly the kind of fragile man that world so often broke. But when word reached him that his vote was needed, he made a choice. He rode. Through a stormy night, through thunder and rain, dozens of miles on horseback, a sick man pushing his body to its limit. He arrived in Philadelphia, mud, and exhausted, still in his riding boots, just in time to cast the vote that swung Delaware toward independence. One sick man on a horse in the dark. That's how close it was. Remove him, and the story we tell about a united, destined nation cracks right down the middle. Now look at Pennsylvania, and the maneuvering gets even quieter and stranger. Its delegation was against independence, or at least too divided to support it. 2 of the men most opposed, including one of the most respected voices in the whole Congress, understood something. They understood that their opposition, however sincere, was about to break the unity everyone needed. So on the day of the crucial vote, they simply stayed away. They deliberately absented themselves, removing their no votes, allowing their colony to fall into the yes column without them having to betray their own conscience by voting for it. Think about the weight of that. Men who believed independence was a mistake, stepping quietly out of the room so that history could move forward without them, sacrificing their own position for the sake of a unity they didn't even fully believe in. This is the machinery we never see, not soaring destiny, sick men on horseback, opponents stepping aside, delegates without authority forced to abstain, a unanimous vote that was in truth stitched together by the thinnest of threads and the quietest of sacrifices. Now let's talk about the forces above all of these men, the larger game they were caught inside. Because the American Revolution wasn't only about America, it was a piece on a much bigger board, a global struggle between empires. France, humiliated by its defeat to Britain in that earlier war, was watching the colonies closely. A British loss in America would be a delicious blow to France's greatest rival. The colonists knew this, and they were desperate for it. Independence wasn't just a declaration of feeling, it was a strategic tool, because no foreign power would openly help a group of rebels trying to patch things up with their king. But a new, independent nation, formerly at war for its very existence, that was something France might just be willing to back with money, guns, ships, and soldiers. So the declaration had a hidden audience. It wasn't written only for the king, or even only for the colonists. It was written, in part, for the courts of Europe. It was a job application to the world, a formal announcement that said, we're not rebellious subjects begging for mercy. We're a nation, a real one, and we're worth allying with. That's part of why the language soared so high, why it reached for those universal truths about all men and unalienable rights. It needed to sound like the founding of something legitimate and permanent, something Europe could take seriously and support. So underneath the poetry, there was cold, hard strategy. The founders were fighting a war they couldn't win alone, and they knew it. The Declaration was a desperate, brilliant gamble to turn a local rebellion into a cause the whole world might join. And here's what most people never connect. The men making these enormous decisions, playing this global game, forcing this fragile unity, were the very same fragile human beings we've been talking about all along. Adams, exhausted and far from Abigail. Rodney, dying, hiding his face, riding through a storm. Jefferson, brilliant and contradicted, writing about freedom he denied to others. Ordinary, frightened, mortal men, holding the fate of millions in hands that could be stilled by a fever. They knew the stakes. They knew that if this failed, everything, their lives, their families, their names, would be swept away. And yet, in the machinery of that hot summer, through pressure and fear and quiet sacrifice, they pushed the thing through. They forced a divided people to speak for one impossible moment with a single voice. But out in the real world, far from the maneuvering in Philadelphia, other people were about to pay the true price of that decision. Not with votes or speeches, with their bodies, their homes, their lives. Because declaring a war and surviving one are two entirely different things. And for the ordinary people caught in what came next, the struggle to simply live through it would test the limits of human endurance in ways those men in that room could barely imagine. The words were signed. The declaration was read aloud in town squares to cheering crowds and ringing bells, and then the reality arrived. Because a declaration doesn't stop a bullet. It doesn't feed a starving soldier or warm a freezing one. For the men who actually had to fight this war, and for the families who had to survive it, the year that followed wasn't glory. It was suffering on a scale we can barely comprehend today. Let me take you to the place that became the true test. Not a battlefield, a camp. Its name was Valley Forge, a stretch of cold Pennsylvania hills where the Continental Army went to survive the winter after that famous summer. By then the fighting had gone badly, very badly. The British had taken Philadelphia, the very city where independence was declared. Washington's army, beaten and exhausted, limped into Valley Forge to wait out the winter and try to hold itself together. And that winter nearly finished them. Not the British. The cold, the hunger, and the disease did the killing there. Picture the men who marched into that camp. Many of them had no shoes. Their boots had worn away on the long, brutal marches, and there was no replacing them. So they wrapped their bare feet in rags or in strips of raw animal hide and walked through snow and frozen mud. The trail into Valley Forge, it was said, could be followed by the blood. Bloody footprints in the snow, left by men whose feet were splitting open in the cold. Not a story someone made up to move you. A thing that was actually written down by the men who saw it. They had almost nothing. The supply system had collapsed. Food was so scarce that men sometimes went days with almost nothing to eat. They made a grim little meal they called fire cake, just flour and water baked on a hot stone, tasteless, and barely enough to keep a body moving. Some men, delirious with hunger, cried out for food in the night. They built their own shelter, rows of small log huts, crude and smoky and crowded, thrown together by freezing hands. A dozen men might share one tiny hut, sleeping on the bare, cold ground or on damp straw. The huts filled with smoke that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. But smoke meant fire, and fire meant a chance to live through the night, so they endured it. And then came the real killer, disease. In those cramped, filthy, freezing huts, sickness spread like fire through dry grass. Diseases we can barely name now tore through the weakened men. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, fevers that emptied hut after hut. Of the thousands of men who died at Valley Forge that winter, most didn't fall to British guns. They died coughing, shivering, wasting away in the dark, killed by conditions no army should have had to endure. Something like 2,000 of them, gone, without a single battle being fought. Now hold that image. An army meant to win a nation's freedom, dying slowly in the snow, barefoot and starving, forgotten by the very people they were fighting for. Because that's the part that stings. While those men froze, others profited. There were merchants who'd rather sell their goods to the British in occupied Philadelphia for solid British coin than to their own starving army, which could only pay in nearly worthless paper money. Just miles away from men eating flour and water off hot stones, there was food and cloth and shoes being sold to the enemy for a better price. That's the ugly truth of war that the noble story leaves out. Not everyone sacrificed. Some got rich while patriots died in the snow. And yet, and this is the part that lifts the whole story, they didn't break. Most of them stayed, cold, hungry, unpaid, watching their friends die, and still they stayed. Why? Historians have argued about it for centuries. Some stayed out of loyalty to Washington, who moved among them, sharing their hardship, refusing to abandon them. Some stayed for each other, for the men in the hut beside them, the way soldiers in every war have. And some, incredibly, stayed for the idea. The fragile, unproven idea that they were building something worth all of this. Now let me bring one real person into the snow, because at Valley Forge something remarkable happened, driven by an unlikely man. A foreign officer arrived that winter, a Prussian, a man who went by the grand name of Baron von Steuben, though some of his grand titles were frankly invented to impress the Americans. He barely spoke English. He'd curse at the soldiers in German and French, and when that failed, he'd have an aide curse at them in English for him. The men, freezing and miserable, actually laughed. But this strange, blustering foreigner did something no one else had managed. He took that ragged, dying army and he trained it. All through that terrible winter, on a frozen parade ground, he drilled them. He taught barefoot, starving men how to march together, how to load and fire as one, how to hold a line, how to use a bayonet. He turned a desperate mob of survivors into something that could stand toe-to-toe with the finest army in the world. Think about that discipline. Men who had every reason to lie down and die, instead standing in the snow, learning to be soldiers, hour after hour, day after day. That was the resistance. Not a dramatic charge, not a speech. The quiet, grinding refusal to quit on a frozen hillside when quitting would have been so much easier. And it wasn't only the men. Remember Abigail and the countless women like her? While the army froze, the home front bled in its own way. Women ran the farms and the shops and the households alone, as they had from the start. But now the war pressed harder. Prices soared out of control. That paper money the army was paid in became nearly worthless, so a bag of flour might cost a fortune 1 month and double the next. Families that had been comfortable slid into poverty. Some women followed the armies themselves. Camp followers, they were called. Often wives and widows with nowhere else to go. They cooked, they washed, they nursed the wounded, they buried the dead. A few even carried water to the guns in the middle of battle, stepping over bodies to keep the cannons firing. And the enslaved people caught in this war faced their own agonizing choices. The British offered freedom to any enslaved person who fled their patriot masters and joined the crown. So thousands made a desperate calculation. They risked everything, running toward the British lines, chasing a freedom their own country's soaring words had refused them. Some found it. Many died trying. Some were betrayed and dragged back into bondage. For them, the great question of the war wasn't independence. It was their own bodies, their own lives, their own liberty. So this was survival in the revolution. Bloody footprints in the snow, fire cake on a hot stone, smoke-choked huts and fever in the dark, women holding a collapsing world together, enslaved people gambling their lives on a promise from the enemy, a blustering foreign baron cursing frozen men into an army. All of it, the endurance of thousands of ordinary people, most of whose names we'll never know, refusing, day after impossible day, to let the fragile thing die. And out of that suffering, against every reasonable expectation, the army held. It survived the winter. It marched out of Valley Forge in the spring, ragged still but disciplined, hardened, and somehow more dangerous than before. The war would grind on for years more. But something had changed in that frozen camp. The people had proven they could suffer for this idea and not break. And that endurance, that quiet, stubborn refusal to quit, would echo far beyond that winter, further than any of those freezing men could have dreamed. All the way, in fact, to us, sitting warm and safe in a world their suffering helped make possible, which raises a question that should stop us cold, here, now, in our own comfortable age. If we are handed that same winter, that same hunger, that same darkness, how many of us would stay? Let's come back to now, to the warm room you're sitting in, the light you didn't have to make, the water you can drink without fear. Because here's the strange thing about 1776. It feels impossibly far away, and it's closer to you right now than you might ever guess. Look down at your own life for a second. Almost every comfort you take for granted was born, in some way, from that fragile gamble. The idea that you get a say in who governs you. The idea that a knock on your door in the night should mean something is wrong, not something is normal. The idea that your voice, your vote, your opinion matters at all. None of that was guaranteed. Someone had to risk everything to even suggest it. But the mirror cuts deeper than gratitude, because the arguments of that year aren't dead. They're the arguments we're still having. Start with the one that lit the whole fire. No taxation without representation. The rage of paying into a system while feeling like you have no real voice in it. Does that feel like ancient history to you? Or does it feel like something you heard this week? We still argue, constantly, about who pays and who decides, and whether the people making the rules actually answer to the people living under them. The specific tax on tea is gone. The raw human feeling underneath it, the fury of the unheard, is as alive as it's ever been. Now take the deeper contradiction, the one at the very heart of the founding, a nation that declared all men equal while denying that equality to millions. That crack in the foundation didn't close when the war ended. It ran forward through the centuries, through a civil war, through 100 years of struggle, and it runs right into our own time. Every time this country argues about who truly counts as equal, who's fully included in that word all, we're finishing an argument that started in 1776. Abigail's quiet warning, remember the ladies, wasn't answered for nearly 150 years when women finally won the vote. And people are still, today, asking versions of her question. Here's what makes it personal. We tend to think of the founders as finished, marble, complete. But they handed us something unfinished on purpose, a promise larger than they could keep with the understanding, spoken or not, that someone would have to keep finishing it, that someone is us. Every generation inherits the same half-built house and has to decide whether to keep building or let it fall. Now let's talk about division, because this is where the mirror gets uncomfortable. We looked earlier at how the revolution was really a bitter civil war, neighbour against neighbour, families torn in half over politics. We like to imagine we've grown past that we're more united, more civilised than those tar and feather mobs. But look honestly at the country now, the way politics can split a Thanksgiving table, the way two people can look at the exact same event and see two completely different realities, the way we increasingly sort ourselves into camps that barely speak to each other. The colonists of 1776 would recognise that instantly. They lived it. The lesson they'd offer isn't comfortable, but it's honest. A people can tear itself apart over which version of the truth to believe, and the wounds can last for generations. Now here's a harder mirror, the role of information, of a single, viral message changing everything. Remember Thomas Paine and his pamphlet, one piece of writing in plain language spread hand to hand that shifted the mood of an entire nation almost overnight. We think that's a modern phenomenon, the viral post, the message that reshapes how millions think in a matter of days. It isn't modern at all. Common sense was the viral content of its age, and it did exactly what we watch happen now. Information moving faster than the powerful can control it, changing minds, hardening sides, tipping a whole society toward action. The difference is only speed. They had pamphlets and taverns and word of mouth. We have screens in our pockets that reach the world in a heartbeat. The human machinery underneath, though, ideas spreading, emotions catching fire, is exactly the same. So ask yourself the honest question. If a message can move a nation that fast, who decides what moves, and toward what? Now let's make it even more personal. Think about those men at Valley Forge, barefoot, starving, staying anyway. We live in the most comfortable moment in human history. Warm homes, endless food, medicine that would have looked like magic to them, and it's worth asking gently, what we've traded for it. Those men had almost nothing, and they had something we sometimes struggle to find. A cause they believed was worth their own suffering. A reason to endure that was larger than themselves. I'm not saying suffering is good. Those men would trade places with you in a heartbeat, for warmth, for shoes, for a full stomach. But the mirror asks a fair question anyway. What would we be willing to endure for anything? What idea, what principle would we walk barefoot through the snow for? Most of us don't know, and that not knowing is its own kind of quiet loss. Here's the sharpest point of all. The people of 1776 didn't know how their story ended. We do. That's our great advantage, and our great blind spot. We read their story backward, knowing they won, knowing the nation survived, knowing it all worked out. So we assume it was meant to, but they lived it forward, in fear, in uncertainty, not knowing if any of it would matter, or if they'd all be hanged and forgotten. And that's exactly where we live too. Right now, forward, in uncertainty. We don't know how our chapter ends any more than they knew how theirs would. The taxes and the representation, the unfinished promise of equality, the bitter divisions, the viral ideas, the question of what we'd sacrifice. Every single one of those threads runs straight from their hands into ours. So the real question the mirror asks isn't about them, it's about us. They were handed a broken, dangerous, uncertain world, and they made a choice about what to do with it. What would we do differently in their place? Or, when we look honestly at the choices in front of us right now, would we do anything differently at all? That's not a comfortable place to leave it. But history rarely is, and there's a part of this story that stays unsettled to this very day. A question the founders themselves couldn't answer, that historians still argue over, that has no clean resolution even now. Because for all the noble words and the frozen sacrifice and the fragile victory, there's a shadow running through the whole thing. A contradiction so deep that people still can't agree on what the founding even was. And to look at it honestly, we have to be willing to hold two opposite truths in our hands at the very same time. Here's the question that won't go away. The one historians still argue about, that families still argue about, that this country has never fully settled. Was the American founding a triumph of freedom, or was it built on a foundation of hypocrisy so deep it stains everything? And the honest, uncomfortable answer is, it was both, at the very same time. Let me lay out the two sides fairly, because both are held by serious, thoughtful people, and both are backed by real history. On one side stand those who say the founding was a genuine miracle, and they have a powerful case. For nearly all of human history, people had been ruled by kings, by emperors, by those who claimed the right to command by blood or by God. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, that power should flow up from the people rather than down from a throne, was radical almost beyond belief. It had been tried in scattered moments across history, and it had mostly failed. And here were these men in 1776 writing it down as a founding principle, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that people have rights no king can take away. Those words didn't just create one country. They became a torch that lit revolutions around the world for centuries afterward. France, Latin America, nation after nation reached for the same language, the same idea, the same impossible hope. So on this side, the argument is clear. Yes, the men were flawed, deeply flawed, but the idea they unleashed was one of the greatest gifts in human history, and it's still liberating people today. Judge the seed, not just the flawed hands that planted it. Now hear the other side, because it's just as serious, and it starts with a number that's hard to hold. At the moment those words about equality were written, roughly 1 in 5 human beings in the colonies was enslaved. Hundreds of thousands of men, women and children owned as property, bought and sold, worked and beaten, with no rights at all. And many of the men writing about liberty owned them. This wasn't a small inconsistency. It was the economic engine of much of the new nation. The wealth, the leisure, the very time to sit and debate philosophy was in many cases paid for by stolen labour. So this side asks a brutal, fair question. How much is a promise of freedom worth when the men making it are holding other human beings in chains as they speak? And it goes further. The Declaration said all men are created equal, but in practice, the freedom of that era was reserved for a narrow group. White men who owned property. Enslaved people were property. Women had almost no legal rights of their own. Native nations were about to be pushed off their land in wave after wave of broken promises and violence. Even poor white men, without property, were often shut out of the vote. So this side argues that calling it a birth of freedom is a kind of myth that hides the truth. That the founding was, in large part, about protecting the power and property of a small elite, dressed up in beautiful language about universal rights. Now here's where it gets genuinely hard, because both of these are true, and they don't cancel out. The temptation is to pick one and be done with it, to say it was all glorious and wave away the darkness, or to say it was all a lie and throw out the whole thing. But history won't let you off that easy. The very same document can be both a revolutionary charter of human freedom and a shield for slaveholders at the same moment in the same ink. And there's a fascinating wrinkle that makes it even harder. Some historians point out that the words themselves were more powerful than the men who wrote them, because once you write down that all men are created equal, you've created a standard, a measuring stick that can be turned against you. And that's exactly what happened. Enslaved people, and later abolitionists, and later still the leaders of the civil rights movement, all pointed at those same words and said, "You wrote this, now live up to it." The founders may have meant those words narrowly, but the words escaped them. They became a promise that people who were never meant to be included used to demand their own inclusion generation after generation. So one view says the founders were hypocrites who wrote a lie. Another says they were flawed men who accidentally wrote a truth so large it would eventually overturn their own injustices. Which is it? That's the debate, and it's not settled. Even the founders argued about it among themselves. Some of them knew, clearly, that slavery was a moral catastrophe sitting at the centre of everything. Some wrote privately that they trembled for their country when they remembered that God is just. That was a slaveholder writing about slavery. A man who saw the contradiction, named it, feared it, and still didn't free the people he owned. Even they couldn't resolve it. And the debate isn't just academic. It shapes how we see ourselves right now. If the founding was pure and glorious, then America is a fundamentally good thing that occasionally strayed. If it was rotten at its root, then the whole structure needs to be questioned down to the foundation. How you answer that shapes how you read every headline, every argument, every conflict in the country today. And thoughtful people, patriots all, land in completely different places. Some hold the flawed men and the glorious idea together and call it human. Some can't get past the chains. Some think focusing on the chains dishonours a genuine miracle. Some think ignoring them is its own kind of lie. I'm not going to hand you an answer, because there isn't a clean one, and anyone who gives you one too quickly is selling something. What I can tell you is that the discomfort is the point. The founding was a towering act of courage and a profound moral failure, braided so tightly together you can't fully separate them. To love this history honestly means holding both, the frozen feet at Valley Forge and the enslaved hands in the fields, the soaring words and the men who broke them, the miracle and the crime in the very same year. So here's the question I'll leave with you, and it's a real one, worth sitting with in the quiet. Can something be both a lie and a promise at the same time? Can a nation be founded on a contradiction and still become something worth believing in? The people of 1776 couldn't answer that. We're still trying. And what they built, flawed and glorious and unfinished, didn't stay frozen in that summer. It grew. It changed. It was fought over and rebuilt and expanded in ways those men could never have imagined. Because the story didn't end when the war was won. In many ways, that's exactly where the harder story began. And what came next? The long, slow, painful working out of everything they'd unleashed would reshape not just a nation, but the very idea of what nation could be. The war finally ended, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a slow, exhausted exhale that took years to arrive. The fighting effectively ended at a place called Yorktown in the fall of 1781. Trapped between Washington's army on land and a French fleet at sea, the main British force surrendered. As their soldiers laid down their arms, a British band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." And it had been. The impossible had happened. A ragged collection of colonies had beaten the most powerful empire on earth. But winning a war and building a nation are two very different things. And this is the part of the story that almost never gets told, because it isn't dramatic. It's the slow, grinding work of turning an idea into a country. Because here's the secret that follows every revolution. The moment you win is the moment your real problems begin. For years, these 13 colonies had been united by one thing, a common enemy. Now that enemy was gone. And what was left was 13 proud, suspicious, wildly different states that didn't fully trust each other and certainly didn't want to answer to any central power. They'd just fought a long, bloody war precisely to escape a distant government telling them what to do. The last thing most of them wanted was to build a new one. So their first attempt at nation was deliberately weak. A loose agreement called the Articles of Confederation. Under it, the central government was almost powerless on purpose. It couldn't really tax. It couldn't force the states to do much of anything. It was less a country and more a nervous alliance of 13 little countries, each guarding its own power, and it nearly fell apart. Within just a few years, the cracks were everywhere. The new nation was drowning in debt from the war. It couldn't pay the soldiers who'd bled for it. It couldn't manage trade. The states squabbled and undercut each other. The money was nearly worthless. Then came a warning that terrified the founders. Out in western Massachusetts, desperate farmers, many of them war veterans, rose up in armed rebellion. They were being crushed by debt and taxes, losing their farms, some being thrown in prison. Led by a former army captain named Daniel Shays, they took up arms against their own state government. The very men who'd fought for the revolution were now rebelling against what it had become. The uprising was put down. But it sent a shock of fear through the leaders of the new nation. If they couldn't hold this together, everything they'd suffered for would collapse into chaos. And so, out of that fear came the second founding, the one that actually built the country we live in. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered again in Philadelphia. They'd been sent to fix the weak articles. Instead, behind closed doors and locked windows in secret, They threw them out entirely and built something new. They wrote the Constitution, the framework of government that still runs America today, the oldest written national constitution still in use anywhere on Earth. And it was a masterpiece of compromise and of fear. These men were terrified of two opposite dangers. They feared a government too weak to function, like the one that had just nearly collapsed, and they feared a government too strong that could become the very tyranny they'd just escaped. So they built a machine designed to fight itself. 3 branches of government deliberately set against one another, a president to lead, a Congress to make laws, a court to judge them, each one able to check and block the others, so that no single person and no single group could ever seize total power. They didn't trust anyone with too much control, so they made sure no one could have it. But the deepest compromises were the darkest, because to get all the states to agree, especially the slaveholding states, they made deals with slavery itself. They wrote compromises into the Constitution that protected the institution of slavery without ever quite naming it. They agreed to count enslaved people as a fraction of a person for the purpose of representation, giving slave states more power while denying those very people any humanity at all. They agreed to protect the slave trade for another 20 years. The contradiction we talked about earlier wasn't resolved. It was built into the machinery of the new nation, deliberately, as the price of union. The founders kicked that terrible problem down the road to future generations, and the bill would eventually come due in blood, in a civil war that nearly destroyed everything. And then they added something crucial, because many people refused to accept this powerful new government without protection for the individual. So they added the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to a fair trial, protection from unreasonable searches, limits on the government's power over ordinary people, the specific promises that still shape your daily life, right now, today. Think about that. The reason a government official can't simply silence you, or search your home without cause, or lock you away without a trial, traces directly back to these anxious men, still haunted by the tyranny they'd fought. And the influence didn't stop at America's borders. This was the consequence that reshaped the world. The American experiment proved something people had doubted for all of human history, that a large nation could actually govern itself without a king, that the radical idea could work. Just a few years later, France exploded into its own revolution, borrowing American language and American ideas. Then came revolutions across Latin America, throwing off European empires, reaching for the same self-government. Over the next 2 centuries, colony after colony, nation after nation, would point to what happened in America and say, if they could do it, so can we. The world we live in now, a world mostly of republics and constitutions rather than kings and empires, was set in motion by that fragile gamble. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but undeniably. And here's what almost no one appreciates. None of it was guaranteed. At every step it could have failed. The war could have been lost. The states could have splintered. Shays' rebellion could have spread. The Constitutional Convention could have collapsed in anger. Any one of 100 moments could have sent the whole thing crumbling into a footnote about a rebellion that didn't quite work. But it held. Through fear, compromise, contradiction, and sheer stubborn will, it held. A group of frightened, flawed, brilliant, and deeply compromised people built a structure that has now lasted, amended and battered and evolving, for well over 2 centuries. They built it out of the daily lives we started with. The cold houses, the lost children, the fermented drink and the endless labour. From that hard, ordinary, mortal world, they reached for something that would outlast every single one of them. And it did. but a structure is just bones. The deeper question is what happened to the people, to their spirit, to the very idea of who they were. Because winning independence didn't just change the laws, it changed something inside the men and women who lived through it. It began to forge, slowly and painfully, an entirely new kind of person, a new identity that had never existed on the earth before. Something new was born in those years, not just a country, a kind of person. Before the revolution, if you'd asked a farmer in Massachusetts who he was, he might have said he was a subject of the king, an Englishman living in America, a Virginian, or a Bostonian, loyal to a crown across the sea. But by the time the smoke cleared, a strange new word had taken hold. American. It sounds so ordinary to us now. But it was in its moment almost revolutionary all by itself. These people had stopped being subjects and become citizens. And the difference between those two words is the difference between two entire ways of seeing yourself in the world. A subject is ruled. A subject bows. A subject owes loyalty upward to a person born to power. A citizen is different. A citizen, at least in the idea, is a part owner of the country, a participant, someone whose consent actually matters. That shift from subject to citizen changed something deep in the human spirit. It planted an idea that would prove impossible to uproot. The idea that you're not lesser than the people who govern you, that you are, in some fundamental way, their equal. Now watch how that idea began to spread, in ways the founders never intended. Because once you tell people they're equal, you can't fully control where that belief goes. Think back to Abigail Adams and her quiet warning. Remember the ladies. She'd been dismissed with a smile, but the idea she'd voiced didn't die. It waited. In the decades after the revolution, women began, slowly, to claim more of a role in the life of the new nation. They were raising the next generation of citizens, and a new notion took hold, that a mother had a genuine civic duty to shape good, virtuous, self-governing children. It was still confined to the home, but it was a foothold, a first crack in the old walls, and that crack widened generation after generation. The daughters and granddaughters of the revolutionary era would keep pushing, until, nearly 150 years after Abigail wrote her letter, women finally won the right to vote, finishing an argument she'd started at her kitchen table with cannons in the distance. The same was true, even more painfully, for enslaved Americans. The words of the Declaration became a weapon in their hands. Free black Americans and abolitionists pointed straight at those founding promises. You said all men are created equal, they argued. You wrote it down. So how do you justify this? The nation's own words became the case against its greatest sin. That argument couldn't be won quickly. It would take a civil war, the bloodiest in the nation's history, to begin to answer it. But the seed was planted in 1776, in words that meant more than the men who wrote them ever intended. Now look at how the country itself was changing. Because the transformation wasn't only about ideas, it was physical, restless, hungry. A new spirit took hold, one that would define the American character for centuries, the belief that you weren't stuck where you were born. In the old world, a peasant's son became a peasant. A blacksmith's son became a blacksmith. Your birth was your destiny. But in this new nation, with its vast open lands to the west, a different possibility took root. The idea that a person could remake himself, move, rise, become something his father never was. People began to move in enormous numbers, across the mountains into the Western Territories, chasing land and reinvention, the restless, mobile, always moving towards something quality that still marks American life was being forged in those first decades. And with it came a new kind of confidence, sometimes a reckless, arrogant confidence, but a powerful one. A sense that the future was something you could build, not just endure. That tomorrow could be better than today, and that it was somehow your right and your job to make it so. That optimism, that forward-leaning hunger, became stitched into the national character. But let's be honest about the shadow side, because this transformation had a terrible cost and it fell on others. That hunger for Western land meant pushing onto ground where native nations had lived for thousands of years. The new American confidence, the belief in remaking the world, too often became a justification for taking, for displacing, for destroying. The same spirit that lifted ordinary white families toward new opportunity crushed entire peoples beneath it. The transformation into a new kind of nation was, for the original inhabitants of the land, a catastrophe. That too is part of who America became, and you can't tell the story honestly without it. Now come back to the individuals we've followed, because they were transformed too, personally, by what they'd lived through. Think of the ordinary soldier who'd frozen at Valley Forge. He went home a different man than the one who'd left. He'd seen the finest army in the world break in front of him. He'd learned that he, a common farmer, could stand in a line and hold that line against empire. He came home carrying a new sense of his own worth, his own agency, that no one could ever fully take from him again. And think of Abigail, growing older in her farmhouse. She'd watched a nation born from her hilltop, run a farm through a war, buried a child, raised a future president, and quietly argued for a freedom she herself was denied. She lived to see her husband become president. She lived to see her son begin the path that would make him president too. A farm wife who'd heard cannons in the night became, in her own quiet way, a founder of a dynasty and a nation. That was the transformation. Not just laws and borders, people remade from the inside, subjects who became citizens, farmers who became soldiers and then something more, women who found a voice, even when no one wanted to hear it, a whole people who stopped asking permission to exist and started deciding what they wanted to become. It was messy, it was contradictory, it left millions behind in chains and on stolen land. But it was real. A genuinely new kind of society was struggling to be born, carrying both the best and the worst of human nature into an uncertain future. And that new American, restless, hopeful, contradictory, hungry and haunted, is, in a very real sense, still you. The person listening to this right now, you are the descendant of that transformation, carrying its gifts and its unfinished wounds. Which brings us to the hardest and most valuable part of this whole story. Not what happened, not even why, but what it means. What this strange, brutal, beautiful year can actually teach us if we're quiet enough and honest enough to listen. So what do we actually take from all of this? Not a lecture, not a moral pinned neatly to the end like a bow on a package. Something quieter than that. Something the story itself has been trying to tell us the whole time, if we slow down enough to hear it. Here's the first thing. The people who changed history didn't know they were changing history. We have to keep reminding ourselves of that, because it's so easy to forget. When we look back, we see giants, marble men, inevitable heroes marching toward a destiny they could see clearly. But that's not how they experienced it. They experienced it the way you experience your own life, as confusion, as fear, as a series of hard choices made with incomplete information, never sure if they were right. Abigail didn't know her letters would be read for centuries. The soldier at Valley Forge didn't know he was securing a nation. He just knew his feet were bleeding and he was hungry. They were ordinary people, fumbling forward in the dark exactly like us. And that's the first piece of wisdom, and it's strangely freeing. History isn't made by special people in special moments. It's made by ordinary people in ordinary moments who simply refuse to give up. The greatness came later, in the retelling. In the living, it was just people doing the next hard thing and then the next one after that. Which means the people alive right now, including you, are making history too, without knowing which small choice will echo forward. Here's the second thing the story gives us. The most important decisions are made when the outcome is completely unknown. We admire the founders for winning. But the courage wasn't in the winning. Anyone can be brave after they know they'll succeed. The courage was in acting when they had every reason to believe they'd fail, signing their names when the noose was a real possibility, staying in the frozen camp when desertion was easy and survival wasn't promised, riding through a storm, sick and in pain, to cast a single vote that might mean nothing. That's what real courage looks like, not certainty, not confidence. Doing the right thing, or the necessary thing, precisely because you're afraid and doing it anyway. And here's why that matters for you personally. Because you'll never have certainty either. The big choices in your own life, the ones about love and work and what you'll stand for, all get made in the fog. Waiting for certainty is just a comfortable way of never acting at all. The people in this story teach us that you move forward through the fear, or you don't move at all. Now here's a harder, deeper piece of wisdom. Something can be deeply flawed and still be worth fighting for. We saw the contradictions, the chains alongside the soaring words, the hypocrisy braided into the hope. And there's a temptation, when you see the flaws in something, to throw the whole thing away. To say, it's imperfect, so it's worthless. But this story teaches something more mature than that. The founders built something broken, and it was still, somehow, one of the most valuable things anyone had ever built. The lesson isn't to excuse the flaws, it's to understand that everything real is flawed. Every person, every nation, every cause, every marriage, every dream. Perfection isn't available to human beings. The choice isn't between the flawed thing and the perfect thing. It's between the flawed thing you work to improve and nothing at all. The wisest response to a broken inheritance isn't to burn it down or to pretend it's perfect. It's to pick it up, honestly, see it clearly, and keep working to make it better. That's what every generation since has been called to do. That's what we're called to do now. Here's the fourth thing, and it's about time itself. The founders planted trees they knew they'd never sit under. Abigail's argument for women wasn't answered in her lifetime, or her daughters, or her granddaughters. The full promise of equality is still, right now, being worked out centuries later. These people made sacrifices whose rewards would fall entirely to strangers, to people they'd never meet, to us, and they did it anyway. There's a profound kind of wisdom in that, in caring about something larger than your own lifespan, in doing work whose fruit you'll never taste, for people you'll never know, simply because it's right. We live in an age obsessed with the immediate, instant results, instant gratification. What can I get right now? And the people of 1776 offer a quiet rebuke to that. They remind us that the most meaningful things we do might be the ones we never see completed. The kindness passed forward, the foundation laid for someone else, the tree planted for a shade you'll never feel. And here's the last piece, the one that ties it all together. Freedom is not a thing you win once. We tend to think of it that way, that the founders won freedom, and now we have it, safe in a vault, permanent, done. But that's not what this story shows. Freedom, it turns out, isn't a possession. It's a practice. It has to be renewed, defended, argued over, and extended generation after generation, or it quietly withers. Every generation inherits it unfinished and has to decide all over again whether to keep it alive. The founders didn't hand us a finished gift. They handed us a responsibility. And that's the real wisdom hiding inside this whole story. Not that some great men once did a great thing long ago, but that the thing they started isn't finished, that it was never meant to be finished, that it lives or dies in what ordinary people in every generation choose to do with it, including this one, including us, including you, right now, in whatever small corner of the world you occupy. The cold houses and the lost children and the frozen feet in the snow weren't the end of a story. They were the beginning of one, a story that was handed still unfinished from their hands to ours. And that raises the deepest question of all, not about them and what they became, but about us. Who did we become because of what they did? And who are we still choosing to be? Let's talk about us, not the founders, not the past, us, the people alive right now, carrying all of this whether we realize it or not. Because here's something worth sitting with quietly tonight. You are living inside their answer. Every founder, every soldier, every farm wife, every enslaved person who ran toward a fragile promise was reaching toward a future they couldn't see. That future is the ordinary Tuesday you woke up to this week. You're the world they were dreaming about and dreading and gambling everything on. So who did we become? That's the real question of this whole story. Start with something simple, something you carry without noticing. A certain restlessness, a certain refusal to just accept things as they are. There's a reason Americans, more than almost anyone, tend to believe that things can be changed, that a bad situation isn't permanent, that you can pack up, move on, start over, remake your life. That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It was forged in those first restless decades, and it lives in us still. We're a people who, at our best, don't bow easily, who ask, why is it this way? And then, who says it has to stay this way? That questioning spirit, that refusal to simply obey, is part of the inheritance. It can be maddening, it can tip into arrogance, but it's ours, handed down from people who looked at a king and decided they didn't need one. But there's a harder part of the inheritance too, and honesty requires that we hold it. We also inherited the contradiction, the gap between what we say we are and what we actually do. We are the country that wrote all men are created equal while holding people in chains. And that gap, that ache between the ideal and the reality, is still the deepest feature of the American character. We are, in a sense, defined by the distance between our promises and our performance. But here's what's remarkable, and I mean genuinely remarkable. That gap has also been our engine. Every great movement toward justice in this country's history has worked the same way. It has taken those founding words, those beautiful, unkept promises, and held them up like a mirror. It has said, you claimed this. Now become it. That's what the fight against slavery did. That's what the fight for women's suffrage did. That's what the civil rights movement did, standing on the steps of monuments to founders, quoting their words back to them, demanding the nation finally mean what it said. So the contradiction isn't only our shame, it's also our unfinished assignment. The promise that was too big for the people who made it became the standard that their descendants keep reaching toward. And that's who we are, maybe more than anything. A people defined not by having arrived, but by still trying to get there. Think about what that means for how you see yourself. You're not the end of this story. You're the middle of it. The founders are behind you, flawed and brave. And ahead of you are people not yet born, who will inherit whatever you choose to leave them. You're a link in a chain that stretches from a cold farmhouse in 1776 to a future neither of us can see. That's a strange and humbling place to stand, between the dead who gambled for you and the unborn who'll live with your choices. And it means something they understood, and we sometimes forget. The country isn't a thing that was finished and handed to you. It's a thing that's being made continuously by everyone who lives in it, including you. Every generation gets to decide whether to keep the promises or break them, whether to widen the circle of who counts as equal or narrow it, whether to carry the whole complicated inheritance forward or let it slip. The people of 1776 made their choice in the dark, not knowing how it would turn out. And now the choosing has passed to us. The same fog, the same uncertainty, the same weight. Here's what I want you to feel quietly before we reach the end. You're not separate from this history. You are its living continuation. When you vote or don't, when you speak up or stay silent, when you extend a hand to someone unlike you or turn away. You're writing the next line of a story that started long before you were born. The founders aren't strangers in old paintings. They're more like distant family who left you a house. And the house is beautiful and it's broken. Some rooms are magnificent. Some were built on suffering. Some were never finished at all. And now you live in it. And what you do with it is up to you. Do you patch the cracks or paper over them? Do you finish the unfinished rooms or let them fall in? Do you honour the good in what they left while honestly facing the wrong? That's not a question for the founders anymore. It's a question for us. For every one of us. For you. Because the truth is, a nation isn't its documents, or its monuments, or its old stories. A nation is the living people who choose every single day what it will be. We are what became of 1776. Not the marble version, the real one. Flawed, hopeful, restless, contradicted, and still, after all this time, reaching for something we haven't quite grasped. And the question of whether we ever will, whether the promise finally gets kept or slowly gets forgotten. That question doesn't belong to history. It belongs to the future, to a future that's arriving quietly, whether we're ready for it or not. And when we look toward that future, toward what comes next, and what all of this was finally for, we arrive at the strangest realization of all. The one that changes how you'll see this entire story, and maybe how you see the very ground you're standing on tonight. Let's look forward now, past our own time, past the year on your calendar, toward the people who'll one day look back at us, the way we've spent these hours looking back at 1776. Because here's the thought that should quietly unsettle you tonight. To them, we're the past. Someday, not so far off, people will study our era. They'll look at how we lived, what we believed, what we got wrong, and they'll shake their heads at us, the way we shake our heads at candlelit rooms and bloodletting doctors. Think about what they'll see. A people who had more power, more knowledge, more comfort than any humans in history, and who still, somehow, couldn't fully solve the oldest problems. Division, injustice, the gap between what we said and what we did. Just like the founders, we'll be judged as flawed people who lived in a flawed time. Some of what we're certain about right now will look, to them, as strange as bloodletting looks to us. That's not an insult. It's just the arrow of time, pointing the only direction it ever points. But here's the deeper mirror. The people of 1776 couldn't imagine us. They couldn't imagine a world of clean water and full stomachs and light at the touch of a finger. They couldn't imagine that their fragile gamble would grow into something so vast and so powerful. They were planting in the dark with no idea what would grow. And we're doing exactly the same thing, right now. Every choice we make about how we treat each other, about what kind of world we're building, is a seed planted in a darkness we can't see through. We have no more idea how our story ends than Abigail did, watching smoke rise from her hilltop. We are, all of us, still living forward into a fog. So let me ask you the question, This entire story has been circling, the one underneath all the others. We started by asking whether you could survive a single year in 1776, the cold, the disease, the endless labour, the nearness of death. But maybe that was the wrong question all along. Maybe the real question isn't whether you could survive their world. It's whether you'd have the courage to do what they did in it, to risk something, to plant a tree you'll never sit under, to act without certainty for a future you'll never see. Because that, in the end, is what they left us. Not a perfect country, not a finished promise. They left us proof. Proof that ordinary, frightened, flawed people can reach beyond themselves. That a farmer with bleeding feet, a wife with a candle and a pen, a sick man on a horse in a storm, can bend the direction of history without ever knowing they did. And that same proof is a challenge, passed silently across 2.5 centuries from their hands into yours. So here's the last thing I want you to carry into the quiet tonight. 250 years ago, in cold houses lit by a single flame, people you'll never meet made choices that shape the exact life you're living at this very moment. The water you drink, the words you're allowed to say, the vote you hold, the very idea that your life is your own. All of it reached you across the centuries from strangers who gambled in the dark and never knew if they'd won. One day, someone will be sitting where you are now, in a world we can't imagine, wondering what we were like, wondering if we were brave, wondering if we kept the promise or let it slip through our fingers in the night. And the answer they find, the story they tell about us, is being written quietly, right now, by you. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The story of ordinary Americans in 1776, their cold mornings, their quiet courage, their unfinished promise, now resting gently in your hands. I'm so glad you stayed with me for this one. This has been Whispered History, where we tell the true, human stories behind the dates you thought you knew. Rest easy, and I'll see you next time.